June 18th, 1815. Dawn breaks over the rain-soaked fields of Mont-Saint-Jean, Belgium. Napoleon Bonaparte stands on a rise near the farmhouse of La Belle Alliance, surveying the army spread before him. 72,000 men, the last army he will ever command. Across the shallow valley, perhaps a mile away, the Duke of Wellington waits with 68,000 soldiers drawn from a dozen nations. And somewhere to the east, invisible in the morning mist, 50,000 Prussians are slogging through knee-deep mud, racing to join the fight. 3 armies, 3 commanders, 1 rain-soaked valley. In the next 8 hours, 50,000 men will fall, killed, wounded, or captured. 23 years of nearly continuous European war will finally end, and Napoleon Bonaparte will lose everything. To understand why this single day carried such weight, we must go back 3 months, to an island in the Mediterranean. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from his exile on Elba and landed on the southern coast of France with 1,000 men. What followed was one of history's most extraordinary marches. Regiment after regiment sent to arrest him instead joined his column. By the time he reached Paris, he commanded an army. The restored Bourbon king fled. Napoleon was emperor once more. But Europe would not accept his return. Meeting in Vienna, the great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, declared Napoleon an outlaw. Not France, him, personally. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, only war. Napoleon understood his position with cold clarity. France was exhausted after 2 decades of war. He could not survive if the coalition combined its full strength against him. His only chance was to strike first, to defeat the Allied armies in Belgium before the Russians and Austrians could arrive. 2 enemy forces stood in his path: the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Field Marshal Blücher's Prussians. Napoleon's strategy was vintage Bonaparte: drive between them, defeat each in turn before they could unite. On June 16th, the plan seemed to be working. At Ligny, Napoleon defeated Blücher's Prussians, inflicting over 20,000 casualties. The old marshal, 72 years old, was unhorsed, ridden over by cavalry, nearly killed. That same day, Marshal Ney fought Wellington to a standstill at the crossroads of Quatre Bras. But the victory at Ligny was incomplete. A catastrophic failure of coordination meant that d'Erlon's entire corps, 17,000 men, marched between both battlefields and fought in neither. The Prussians were beaten, but not destroyed. And then Blücher made the decision that would seal Napoleon's fate. Wounded, exhausted, his army bloodied, Blücher faced a choice. He could retreat east toward his supply lines in Germany, the safe, sensible option. Or he could retreat north toward Wavre, staying within supporting distance of Wellington. He chose north. He had given Wellington his word. "I shall come," he had promised, "even if I have to tie myself to my horse." That promise would destroy Napoleon. The night of June 17th, a tremendous storm broke over Belgium. Rain fell in sheets, turning the clay soil into a morass. Artillery pieces sank to their axles. Horses struggled in mud up to their bellies. The fields of Mont-Saint-Jean became a swamp. Napoleon, who had risen as an artillery officer, understood what this meant. Cannonballs achieved their deadliest effect by bouncing across hard ground, tearing through rank after rank. On soft earth, they would simply bury themselves on impact. He needed the ground to dry, so he waited. The attack that should have begun at dawn was postponed to nearly noon. Those few hours of delay were a gift to Blücher, time for his battered army to rest, regroup, and begin their march toward the sound of the guns. If Napoleon had attacked at first light, he might have crushed Wellington before the Prussians arrived. Instead, he waited. That decision would cost him his empire. At 11:30, the guns finally spoke. The Battle of Waterloo opened not against Wellington's main line, but against a fortified farmhouse on the Allied right flank, Hougoumont. A walled chateau surrounded by formal gardens, an orchard, and dense woodland, it anchored Wellington's position like a fortress. Napoleon's plan was simple, a feint. Attack Hougoumont, force Wellington to weaken his center by sending reinforcements to his right, then strike the weakened center with overwhelming force. It was a sound plan. It did not survive contact with the enemy. Rey's corps advanced through the woods south of the chateau. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Musket fire at point-blank range, bayonets in the undergrowth, men dying among the trees. The British guards defending the position fought with cold ferocity. The French took the woods. They reached the walls, and there they stopped. What Napoleon intended as a diversion became a fixation. French commanders, their blood up, fed more and more troops into the assault. One brigade, then a division. By the end of the day, nearly 14,000 French soldiers would be committed against a position held by fewer than 3,000 defenders. The crisis came at the North Gate. A huge French lieutenant named Legros, called l'enfonceur, the smasher, led a group of soldiers who hacked through the wooden doors with an axe. French troops poured into the courtyard. For a moment, the chateau seemed lost. Then, Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonell and Sergeant James Graham led a handful of guardsmen in a desperate counterattack. They threw themselves against the massive gates, straining to force them closed against the press of French soldiers. Fighting hand to hand, they pushed the doors shut and barred them. Every French soldier who had entered the courtyard was killed, except for a young drummer boy, spared because of his age. Wellington would later say that the success of the entire battle turned upon closing the gates of Hougoumont. The chateau burned through the afternoon, flames consuming the buildings while the defenders held the walls. By the end of the day, the grounds were carpeted with French dead. Napoleon had wanted to draw Wellington's reserves to the flank. Instead, it was the French who were drawn in. 14,000 men wasted against walls they could not breach. While Hougoumont burned, Napoleon prepared his main assault against Wellington's center. 80 guns, the famous Grand Battery, opened a bombardment meant to shatter the Allied line. But Wellington had chosen his ground well. He had positioned most of his infantry on the reverse slope of the ridge, invisible to French gunners. The cannonballs that should have torn through packed ranks instead sailed overhead or buried themselves in the soft, rain-soaked earth. The bombardment that should have been devastating was merely unpleasant. At 1:30, the guns fell silent. 17,000 men of d'Erlon's First Corps began their advance. And here, a fatal error. Rather than attacking in the flexible battalion columns that had conquered Europe, d'Erlon formed his divisions into massive rectangular formations, dense blocks of men, perhaps 140 soldiers wide and 24 ranks deep. The formation was impressive. It was also a catastrophic mistake. In those dense columns, only the front ranks could fire. When threatened from the flanks, there was no room to maneuver, no time to change formation. D'Erlon's men were walking into a trap of their own making. As the French crested the ridge, they were met by shattering volleys from British and Hanoverian infantry. General Sir Thomas Picton led a countercharge and was killed instantly, shot through the head while shouting orders. The French advance stalled in a chaos of smoke and screaming men. Then came the cavalry. Lord Uxbridge unleashed the British heavy cavalry, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade, including the legendary Scots Greys on their pale horses. They crashed into d'Erlon's tangled formations like a thunderbolt. The French columns, too densely packed to form defensive squares, were ridden down. Sergeant Charles Ewart of the Scots Greys fought his way to the Eagle standard of the 45th Regiment of the Line and cut down its defenders one by one, through the head, through the face, through the body. He rode back with the eagle held high, the ultimate trophy. 2 eagles were captured that day. For a regiment to lose its eagle was a stain that could never be erased. But the British cavalry, intoxicated by success, charged too far. They swept across the valley into the French gun line, and there the French lancers caught them. The pursuit became a slaughter. The Union Brigade was virtually destroyed, winners who could not stop winning until they lost everything. By 3 o'clock, D'Erlon's assault had been shattered. But Wellington's heavy cavalry was finished as a fighting force. Both sides were bleeding. Neither had broken. Around 4 o'clock, Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, observed movement behind Wellington's ridge. Wagons moving, men walking rearward. In truth, it was nothing. Wounded being evacuated, ammunition being repositioned. But Ney saw what he wanted to see, an army in retreat. Without infantry support, without consulting Napoleon, he ordered the cavalry forward. It was the worst mistake of his career. 5,000 cavalry charged up the slope, cuirassiers in gleaming steel breastplates, lancers with pennants streaming, the finest horsemen in Europe. When they crested the ridge, they expected to see a fleeing enemy. Instead, they found British infantry standing in squares. The square formation was simple and devastating. Soldiers formed a hollow rectangle, bayonets pointing outward in every direction like the spines of a hedgehog. Horses would not charge into a solid wall of steel. Wave after wave of French cavalry crashed against the squares and broke apart like surf against rocks. They swirled between the formations, slashing at anyone within reach, but they could not break in. Captain Cavalier Mercer commanded a battery of Royal Horse Artillery. Rather than shelter inside the squares as ordered, he kept his guns in action, firing canister into the massed horsemen at point-blank range. "We saw them coming," he wrote later. "A mass of steel and horseflesh. We fired. The front rank simply disappeared. And still they came." The French cavalry captured Wellington's guns again and again. They had forgotten to bring nails to spike the touch holes.
Damn it!
Every time they fell back to regroup, the British gunners ran out and resumed firing. The same guns killed Frenchmen wave after wave. By 6 o'clock, nearly 10,000 French cavalry had been committed. Ney had 5 horses shot beneath him. The charges finally ended, not from decision, but from exhaustion. The horses were blown. The men were spent. The squares had held. The slopes were carpeted with dead horses. Men lay tangled with their mounts. And the French cavalry, the finest in Europe, had been wasted for nothing. While Ney squandered his cavalry, the sound of gunfire rolled in from the east. Blücher had kept his promise. Since mid-morning, the Prussians had been forcing their way through the muddy lanes and swampy ground between Wavre and Waterloo. By 4:30, the leading elements of Bülow's 4th Corps, perhaps 30,000 men, reached the battlefield and fell upon the village of Plancenoit, directly threatening Napoleon's right flank and his only line of retreat. The fighting at Plancenoit was medieval in its savagery. Prussians and French battled house to house, room to room, through the churchyard and among the graves. The village changed hands multiple times, bodies piled in the narrow streets. Napoleon was forced to commit his reserves, first the Young Guard, then 2 precious battalions of the Old Guard itself, just to hold Plancenoit. The troops he needed to break Wellington were dying in a village his maps barely showed. At 6:30, disaster struck Wellington's center. The fortified farmhouse of La Haye-Saint, which had anchored his line all day, finally fell. Major Bering's King's German Legion Battalion had fought magnificently, but they had run out of ammunition. The last defenders were overwhelmed, fighting with bayonets alone. French guns and sharpshooters moved to within 300 yards of Wellington's line. Officers were picked off. Entire companies were shredded by close-range artillery. The center began to waver. An aide rode to Wellington, asking where the reserves were. "There are none," Wellington replied. "Every Englishman must die on the spot we now occupy." It was the crisis of the battle. Wellington's line was cracking. One more blow might shatter it. But Napoleon had no fresh troops to deliver that blow. His reserves were bleeding out at Plancenoit. The price of fighting two armies at once was that he had not enough men for either. He had one option left, one final gamble. At 7:30, the drums began to beat. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's final reserve, the elite of the elite, was forming for its last advance. These were the men who had conquered Europe. The bearskin-capped grenadiers of the Old Guard, the veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram. They had never been defeated in a major battle. Napoleon rode before them. "Wellington is beaten," he told them. "One more push and he will break." They believed their emperor. They had always believed him. 5 battalions stepped off into the smoke, perhaps 3,000 men. The drums beat the pas de charge. They marched up the slope in perfect formation, closing ranks as artillery tore gaps in their lines. Men fell. The survivors pressed on. They crested the ridge and found nothing. The slope ahead seemed empty. Where was the broken enemy? Where were the fleeing soldiers they had been promised? Then Wellington's voice rang out across the ridge. "Now, Maitland, now's your time! Up, guards, and at them!" 1,500 British guardsmen rose from the tall rye grass where they had been lying concealed. They had been invisible, and now they were 40 yards away. The volley crashed out. At that range, they could not miss. The front ranks of the Imperial Guard were scythed down. Before the survivors could recover, Colonel John Colborne wheeled his 52nd Light Infantry into their flank. Crossfire from 2 directions, the deadliest trap on any battlefield. And then the unthinkable happened. The Imperial Guard stopped. They wavered. They began to step back. Someone screamed the words that would echo through history. "La garde recule!" The Guard is retreating. The words spread through the French army like fire through dry grass. If the Guard could retreat, all was lost. The Guard had never retreated. It was impossible. But there it was. In moments, the French army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Formations dissolved. Men threw down their weapons. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a panic-stricken flight. Wellington raised his hat, the signal for general advance. Across the entire ridge, the Allied lines surged forward. From the east, the Prussians swept in, their cavalry hunting fugitives through the night. Only a handful of Old Guard squares maintained formation, fighting rearguard actions as they slowly retreated, buying time for Napoleon to escape. When British officers called on them to surrender, the response came back. Legend says from General Cambronne himself, "La garde meurt et ne se rend pas." The Guard dies, but does not surrender. Or, perhaps, as Cambronne later admitted, he simply shouted one word: "Merde!" Either way, Napoleon's empire died with them on that ridge. When the sun rose on June 19th, the fields of Waterloo were carpeted with the dead and dying. 50,000 casualties, perhaps more. 33,000 French, 17,000 from Wellington's army, 7,000 Prussians. All fallen in less than 12 hours, in a space barely 3 miles across. The surgeons worked through the night and into the next day. There was no anesthetic, only speed and strong hands holding men down. Piles of severed limbs grew outside the field hospitals. The wounded who couldn't be reached lay in the mud for days, crying for water, for help, for death. Napoleon escaped the battlefield in his carriage, then on horseback when the roads clogged with fugitives. He reached Paris and abdicated on June 22nd, just 4 days after his empire had collapsed. He surrendered to the British, hoping for asylum in England. Instead, he was exiled to St. Helena, a windswept island in the South Atlantic, as far from Europe as his captors could manage. He never returned. He died there in 1821, aged 51, still dictating his memoirs, still refighting his battles, still insisting that destiny had betrayed him. Wellington rode across the battlefield as the sun rose. He had won the most consequential battle of the age. He looked like a man who had witnessed the end of the world. "Next to a battle lost," he said later, "the greatest misery is a battle gained."
Victory.
He would never command in battle again. Waterloo did more than end Napoleon's career. It closed an era. The Congress of Vienna's settlement, the order that Wellington had helped to establish, would reshape Europe for a century. The concert of Europe kept the great powers at peace, more or less, until 1914. The British Empire, secured by this victory, would dominate the globe for 100 years. The Age of Revolution gave way to the Age of Empire. The world Napoleon had tried to build by conquest was replaced by the world the victors built through diplomacy and commerce. And in the soil of that Belgian valley, the bones of 50,000 men slowly returned to earth. Local farmers plowed up buttons and musket balls for generations. Teeth were pulled from skulls to make dentures. Waterloo teeth, they were called. The dead fertilized the fields where they had fallen. Few battles in history have carried such weight. In 8 hours, on a muddy Belgian field, 3 commanders and 3 armies decided the shape of the century to come. 250,000 men had marched and fought across Belgium in 4 days. 50,000 never marched again. Wellington called it the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. For Napoleon, it was the end of everything. His power, his glory, his dreams of a European empire united under French rule. For Blücher, it was a promise kept, the satisfaction of seeing his old enemy finally destroyed. And for the men who fell, French, British, German, Dutch, Belgian, Waterloo was simply where their stories ended, in smoke and mud and blood. The moment Napoleon lost everything. The day the world changed forever.